Swinburne University of Technology.
I'm Professor Josie Arnold, and today I'm talking to Dr Craig McIntosh, who's a sociology lecturer. And Craig returned to study as an adult and did a very first-class honours degree, went on and did his PhD, and now is supervising PhD candidates as well as teaching and researching. So today I'm going to talk to Craig about the sociology degree in PhD. So Craig, your PhD in sociology, has that generally got a sort of a model that you recommend your students follow?
No, sociology PhD is reasonably broad-ranging. We can accommodate lots of different interests. Look, the essential thing is that there's research that needs to be done. So there's need to generally to go out into the field to do some primary research.
So first of all, you'd identify that, would you? You'd have a hypothesis or a question or an area of interest? You'd
have an area of interest. We're looking for that sort of infamous gap in the literature.
Yes.
We're looking to find an area in the social world that we engage with individually, so that we're choosing an area in the social world that either annoys us, inspires us, that we think needs to be highlighted, have the light shone on it. And then it's a matter of going through the literature, reading around the topic. I suppose there are a couple of ways to approach it. The way I approached it was I wanted to test a theory. I had a particular interest in a French neo-Marxist theory that explained capitalism. And because there was an evolution in capitalism, this may get tedious, sorry, because there was an evolution in capitalism from one to the other, and this theory hadn't tested the modern form, I thought, well, you beaut.
So it's an historical theory, you've thought about it, you've thought this is a really interesting theory, I wonder how that would work on present day situation.
Yep.
Okay, so we've done that. What happened next?
Look, I suppose the next most important thing is to know your theory.
So that means you've got to do a lot of reading and a lot of thinking, and you don't sort of just suck it in, do you? You say, this is what X says, and I think this about it. So would you make those kind of notes while you were reading?
Oh yeah, you would. I had the advantage, and it's probably a good idea if you move from your honours to your PhD with some carryover, and theory is usually a good carryover. So that you'll find in all sort of theoretical areas, because in sociology, although we talk about theory, and although the understanding of theory in a scientific context is there is a theory that explains everything, in sociology it's probably more correct to call them perspectives. So there are various lenses that you can apply to the social world, and you can apply these various lenses to the same issue and highlight different aspects. Different approaches, different sort of political interpretations can be made depending on what theoretical lens or perspective you use.
So such a theoretical lens or perspective could be post-colonialism or feminism or queer study theories, or so there's a huge range of theoretical perspectives that you really select the one that interests you, neo-Marxism, whatever.
Look, we draw in cultural studies theories, we would draw in feminism, we draw in anthropology. The sociology is a reasonably eclectic discipline, so that we can draw on lots of different theoretical aspects from academia in order to try and get a better understanding of how the social world works. I suppose one of the useful things in terms of progressing from an honours year to a PhD is to take the kernel of the idea, start to sort of tap on the outside, if you like, in order to crack it open, and then you do sort of the cracking open, if you like, in the PhD. So it's a matter of starting small, investigating the world. That gives, in my case, it gave me a year to start to read and imbibe the theory, so that really you're becoming the expert. I mean, the person who is doing the PhD, as distinct from us who may be supervising it, is that they become the expert. We're then to...
And they leave us well and truly behind.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, we're facilitating the process, but they're the experts. So becoming the expert is important, and you can look at historical circumstances. You can look at modern current circumstances. I used the Kennett government, the Victorian state government, of the 90s, because it was developing an approach to dealing with the political world that harmonised really well with this theory that I was looking at. So mine was political sociology. There are all sorts of fields that you can investigate through sociology. I suppose the other important thing is to then have an approach to unpacking the information you've got. Well, there are two things. You need to understand who you're going to be talking to, the sort of people you may be interviewing, because generally we're talking about a qualitative PhD. That is, we're interviewing people in what we describe as a discursive way. So we're asking reasonably open-ended questions in order to get as much information from them as possible. We're digesting what they're saying, and then we're analysing it. I suppose one of the things that I needed to learn was how to interview people, because I interview people appallingly. That's one of the skills that you're probably not taught sufficiently well. So I didn't learn how to shut up. So I went to interviews trying to share information with my interviewees rather than draw the information out. So that's probably...
That's a really important point, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is. I listen back to my interviews and I go, would you shut up?
Yes, yes.
So that's something that it's worth having a chat with your supervisor about, to understand that this is a process about the interviewee and the topic, not about you exploring it together and sort of in concert with the person that you're interviewing. So then the other point that I think is important is the analytical framework. How you're going to work out what you've been given in the context of the question that you're asking, the theory that you're using, and the sort of the results that I'm going to say you wish to get, because to a certain extent when you're choosing a theory, you're choosing a particular bias. You're
it's
not
kind of a road that you take, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
You're on
so,
that road then,
yeah.
and that has a specific destination.
That's right, it does. So it's not a prejudice, but there is a bias. In the same way that, you know, a bowls bowl works, you choose which way you're going to throw the ball down in order to get to a general area that you want to get to, not to a specific outcome. The other important thing in sociology in particular, one of the things we bump up against is that the social world is understood from our point of view in terms of structure, that it's big, influential organisations and institutions that shape and frame us. Then there's on the other side the sort of the notion of the individual, generally the powerful individual, who is able to resist institutional pressures and shape outcomes. So we call this structure and agency. And in a lot of cases in sociology research, certainly in my PhD, at the end I bumped up against this structure and agency problem. And in a PhD you're doing one piece of work. Now that PhD may lead you to years of work, and in those years you may be able to undo this
Gordian knot.
Well, yeah, it is. It's so in my case, I got to the end of my PhD, did a lot of research, interviewed politicians, bureaucrats, a couple of people from the private sector, people from the unions, even our old chancellor. But in order to come to terms with what the theory expected, I bumped up against a powerful person. Jeff Kennett, and a lot of leaders are like that, have so much power and so much individual agency that they stop the expected processes the theory anticipates will happen from happening. So I got to the end of mine and go, well, did I fail because I couldn't say whether the theory worked or not? Well, no, I didn't. I'd done research, I talked to a lot of people, I produced a great deal of data, I brought a lot of insights to the process. At the end, I've tucked into the niche and in this case, these things hadn't been studied in state governments in Australia before. Did that, and then at the end we go, okay, well, the influence of the individual was too great. But then the consequences of that flow on. So in the case of this particular government, the Canada government, we had a government that followed that calmed everything down, so that the agents, the influence of the agent, the influence of the powerful politician, generally when you get somebody like that, you then get a government that sort of calms everything down and tries to bring institutions back together. That's a good time to go back in and see whether the theory works. So one of the potential frustrations of doing a PhD that's dealing with powerful institutions and powerful people is you sometimes don't get the result that you expect. So going back to that notion of the theory creating a bias, didn't create the outcome that I initially went into, but it told me about how the social world worked. So it's a terrifically engaging process, and you learn, I mean, partly I learned about how the political world works.
Right, so are you saying that it can be discursive without a result?
Mm.
So it is the discursive element, it is the element of the information, the data, the way that you handle it, the way it fits within the literature or the gap in the literature that's there. Mm. You don't necessarily, the road might keep going.
Yeah, and the road certainly does keep going, and generally, well, you know probably more than I. Generally, a PhD is an introduction to years of research in that one area. It opens up many
possibilities, doesn't it?
And there can be lots of other possibilities, because the other thing, and I suppose what you don't realise about a PhD, because it sounds glorious and it produces this magnificent piece of work and you get to call yourself a doctor, but a PhD really is simply a demonstration that you can do research. I mean,
you can do a major piece of research that adds something new to the knowledge that it's utilising or discoursing upon. So I always think of it like a shell has little many layers, and they're just very fine layers of nacre. Very few people discover the whole great big shell. They discover one little layer, or they discourse on one little layer.
That's right.
And so it's very important, isn't it, given this, that you find a focus, because you could become very discursive.
Oh yeah, and that's a trick we all have in even writing essay questions, but certainly trying to establish an overarching question that drives a PhD. Students will
start like that.
And our task is to bring it in and not to sort of discourage and disappoint.
That's right.
The PhD candidate by narrowing down what they want to do, because.
And part of this is involved in the students seeing that it's not the last word, the total piece of research, it's not the fun, it's the beginning.
Mm. Yeah.
And that's quite a difficult thing for students to realise, is it?
Yeah. Well, I find that they take advice well. If it's the important dynamic between us, I suppose, the student and the supervisor, is genuineness and sincerity, making sure the student feels like they own it. There's nothing worse than feeling like you're doing your supervisor's PhD, and that does happen. So understanding that they have the ownership, I don't like that, but anyway, they have the ownership of the piece of work, but that the skill that we bring is being able to manage the job that they're going to do rather than dominate the job that they're going to do. And I find if we talk sufficiently about the topic, and if we are pulling it in or are deciding whether it's going to be, say, a historical or a current analysis, if you present the options and the alternatives and an argument for them, and then leave it with the student, it works well. And ultimately, there's an appreciation that you're there for them. I mean, this is to a certain extent, the PhD supervisor is there in service to the student and in service to their PhD. And if you can get that across,
well, it really is for me the highest level of teaching.
Yeah.
And we are very privileged to be able to do it.
Oh, yeah.
On a different note altogether, Craig, I know that you're particularly good at all of the niggly little things you should do for your document. And so, what sort of advice do you have about looking early at editing, at formatting, at keeping your references clean, etc.?
Yeah, look, that's
not that all of us do it.
No, well,
right?
and that's the thing that we as supervisors, I suppose, have to recognise is how does the particular person want to work?
But there are some things they have to do, aren't there?
Oh, there are certain things they have to do. It's how they go about doing them. It's incredibly important to be organised because you're dealing with massive amounts of information. The bibliography in my PhD was 30 pages, you know, and you're familiar with every well, it's a reference list rather than bibliography. You're familiar with every piece of literature in that reference list.
So you need to keep good files.
You've got to keep good files.
You need to follow a good system, the Harvard system or whatever, and it needs always to be the same system.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that your references that you want to use are there now, but you also need to make sure that your references don't do the work for you. Or
well, look, I suppose that's one of the tricks, which hopefully students have learned by the time they get to our level, that all of the reference material, all of the research material you've used goes into your head and comes out in your own words, in your own sort of interpretation of it. So understanding that these things are helping you think rather than substituting for your thoughts in your PhD.
Or just supporting an assertion.
Yeah.
So I think that's important, what you just said, helping you think.
Yeah, yeah, they take you down the path. Look, the other thing I suppose that's important is watching how the student reacts, and we've had this experience together. Sometimes I can see when we're together with a student talking, I'll see that feeling I used to have when I went to my supervisor sometimes, and I'm going, yes, yes, yeah, and I can see I used to leave my supervision sometimes with that terrible prickly feeling behind your eyes like you've just cried, because I've gone through a session where I've just acknowledged everything, all the advice that I've been given, and not understood a bloody word of it, you know. And so being able to identify that in a student, and you know, sometimes they talk about good cop, bad cop in terms of the sort of dual supervision, and I don't think it's quite like that, but I think it's always good to be acute to how the students responding to the information, because sometimes like with me, I lacked the courage, because I suppose of the sort of the intellectual intimidation to question my supervisor, to say, look, I don't understand, or I disagree.
And you must say both of those things at any point where you feel that's come up in you. I think it's no point in leaving, as you're saying, thinking, what was that about? You have to do it. That's what the supervisory meeting is about.
Yeah, it is. And
it is about the supervisor says blah, 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 and you say, what did you mean by this? What did you mean? And you may take notes. Yeah. And taking notes are very important, aren't they? Yeah,
well, now the practice we have is that our PhD students send us in that afternoon the notes of their understanding of what went on, and that's crucially important. So it's important for us to understand, I think, that it's a challenging and intimidating and sometimes frightening process,
particularly to people who come from it from a different background and not straight through from honours, where you've probably already been imbued in it to some extent.
That's true. Yeah. So look, it's a nurturing relationship to a certain extent as well, and it's fair to be aware, from our point of view, to be aware that you'll be doing some sort of pastoral work with the student as well. And then, like you said, making sure that the everyday stuff of writing stuff down, making sure you have page numbers. You know, we're just going through this at the moment.
Yes.
Every time you use something, write down what page it comes from.
That's correct, or it's going to take you many hours of hard work at the end.
And like silly things like save your document,
Yes.
email it to me, all of those things which seem quite prosaic, are important to facilitate the process, because what you want to do as a student is to engage in the material, imbibe the material, make the material sort of a part of you for this period. You live this thing. This becomes a part of your identity. So
That's right.
it's important to be able to absorb that and become absorbed by it. And if you just take care of that everyday stuff, like writing down where you got stuff from, what page it came from, it's just fine. Look, when I worked, I edited each paragraph as I went along.
You would have.
Yeah,
Yes.
I did.
Well done.
My wife, who was doing a PhD at the same time, used to write, and she'd write a chapter, print it all out, and our lounge room floor was covered in pages. And then she'd start putting these things together physically. She beat me. She got there first.
So everyone has a different way of
Yeah.
doing it, but the major thing is to be organised about whatever way you have. Examiners will look at referencing, they will look to make sure that you've got the Harvard style, they'll make sure that your bibliography and references are set out properly. That's something they can check easily.
Yep.
They can easily check if you say, Dr. Brown said this, they'll go straight back to your reference list, and if Brown's not in it, they'll be really cranky with you.
They will.
And you don't want to make your examiners cranky.
You want to
So
love your
those little
examiners.
issues are really quite
Yeah, they are.
important, aren't they?
They are,
They're not
yeah.
the big picture, but they're part of the whole
Yeah,
picture.
and remember, you're sending this thing to people who are experts
That's right.
in that field.
And you're saying, look, I've found something to really facilitate that expertise, to make it bigger and stronger. And that's quite exciting as an examiner, I find that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have to follow the university regulations, we have to follow our own knowledge systems, and you have to cover all of those things.
Look, and I think the other thing for students to be aware when they're selecting a supervisor is you don't have to necessarily have a supervisor from your particular field. You can have a supervisor from sort of allied fields. I mean, I'm not going to have a biologist doing a sociology essay, but I might have a cultural studies person or an anthropology person or a media person.
And you can also have a third supervisor who's an expert who may not, excuse me, be from sociology.
That's right, yeah. So relationship is important, but having somebody, like I had a wonderful experience. Somebody came very late to take over my thing. Wasn't in my area, didn't know my theory, but was a wonderful academic. Gave him everything. He read it. I needed to finish it off. I needed 3 chapters to discuss my results. He read it, came back to me and he said, you're writing 3 chapters. The first one is crisis. The second one is consolidation. And the third one is collapse. They're the 3 words that you will use to title those 3 chapters. Didn't need any more than 3 words.
And
3
that's what the
words, click.
supervisor brings, is the outside eye.
Yeah.
Okay, Craig, well, thank you very much.
My
I'm
pleasure.
sure that has helped students of sociology and students who are thinking about or are doing their PhDs. Thanks again.
My pleasure.
This has been a Swinburne production.